The story of Japan after World War II is commonly told in the West as follows. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrenders, some question marks, anime. But what actually fits in that gap between the Japanese surrender and Goku? No, the answer is not Godzilla. I'm your host David, and today we're going to discuss a key part of that story, Japanese reconstruction. This is the Cold War. After several years of bloody war, 2 nuclear bombs set off on civilian centers, and a recent declaration of war by the Soviet Union, the government of Japan was ready to surrender. They announced that they would accept the Allied terms for surrender known as the Potsdam Declaration. Emperor Hirohito himself announced the unconditional surrender to the Japanese the next day. For many, this was the voice of a legally divine figure under the state-led version of Shinto, giving in to a foreign enemy. It was also the first time most of the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice. What was one of the most important days in Japanese history is celebrated around the world as Victory in Japan Day, or VJ Day, the end of the Second World War. Keep in mind though, Japan's war was beyond the bookends of what is commonly referred to in the West as the Second World War, as their war started in 1937. So, for the Japanese, this was an end to 8 years of bloodshed. The Allies were led by the legendary, certainly in his own mind anyway, General Douglas MacArthur, appointed by President Truman. He arrived later in the month to lead the US occupation. The legal surrender solidified that Japan would no longer be a dictatorship, allowing for democracy and destroying their capacity to make war. For the next 6 years, Japan would be under direct military occupation, with MacArthur more or less in charge of the country. This more considerable latitude of control by the US, as opposed to say Germany, let the Americans shape Japan into whatever they wanted to shape it into, and shape they did. At the end of the war, Japan still controlled over more than just the Japanese home islands, and so the Allies were called in to manage different areas, each of which would have, let's say, historical significance. The Republic of China, preparing for a renewed war with the Communists, took control of the island of Taiwan and the islands in the Taiwan Strait. The US took Okinawa, Japanese-occupied Micronesia, and the Amami and Ogasawara Islands, and the southern half of the Korean Peninsula. The northern half, along with the Kuril Islands and the South Sakhalin, went to the Soviet Union for management. I'm sure that's fine, totally peaceful. Nothing can possibly go wrong with this setup. Now, unlike in Germany, Japan was entirely under American control. Besides US troops, there was only a small force from the British Commonwealth brought in to look after demilitarizing the country. With Truman's concerns about what Stalin appeared to be doing with countries the USSR had occupation over, he intended to keep the occupation of Japan that way. This setup was actually the second draft, with a first occupation plan of Japan scrapped reasonably early on. That was a program which looked a lot more like post-war Germany, complete with occupation zones, and the Soviets prepared to take hold of the northern island of Hokkaido. This turnaround is likely a reason why we don't talk about a North and South Japan today. MacArthur arrived in Japan to find one overwhelming problem: hunger. Japan remained at the brink of starvation for years, and the US's first project was to ship as much food as possible and get it to the people. Quite a task, as there was no functional government, and the urban centers of the country had been devastated by firebombing raids. Ironically, by the same people who were now in the process of rebuilding them. The next project was to deal with the Japanese monarchy. MacArthur wanted a complacent, depoliticized emperor. He would remain as a figurehead, but not interfere with politics. Maybe he can get himself a collection of corgis or something instead. You can imagine going from a semi-divine figure controlling an empire to figurehead was a bitter pill to swallow. The Emperor and MacArthur first met on September 27th, taking this famous photo, and they began to talk. MacArthur famously resisted calls from other Allied leaders to put Hirohito on trial as a war criminal. He knew such an act would turn the Japanese people against the Allied plans for the country, and lobbied to keep him in a ceremonial role, which he did, serving as Emperor of Japan until his death in 1989. Things moved quickly, and over 350,000 American troops were stationed in Japan by the end of 1945, and it only stood to grow until the early 1950s. However, to this day, the US still maintains a sizable military presence in Japan, using it as a base of operations for their work in East Asia. So what's next? How do you rebuild a country? In the case of Japan, you start with tearing old systems down. A primary concern for the US and their allies was to make sure that Japan, much like Germany, would never rebuild and get itself into another war. Japan had to dismantle its imperial holdings. Places like Manchuria, a Japanese conquest since before the Second World War, were returned to China. This return of territory was a strategically important move in the renewed Chinese Civil War, and who got what in the surrender mattered quite a bit, but you'll have to watch our previous video on the subject for more information. Korea, an even older Japanese holding, was given provisional independence. The major holdup was that the peninsula was jointly occupied between the Americans and the Soviet Union, each of which had very different ideas of what Korea should look like. This tension led to a massive war in the early 1950s, and of course you can look forward to seeing that covered on this channel. That conflict is still not resolved to this day, even without the existence of the Soviet Union. If you've ever wondered where the deal with the two Koreas started, well, now you know. On that note, the Soviets just flat out claimed South Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. They kicked out the approximate 400,000 ethnic Japanese people living there, and today the islands have more or less had their Japanese culture removed from them. South Sakhalin is to this day part of Russia, as are the Kuril Islands, but the latter remain a diplomatic sticking point between Japan and Russia. These expulsions led to hundreds of thousands of displaced Japanese people from these islands, the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan, and Manchuria. A massive relocation effort became necessary. With the imperial holdings stripped, the Allies then needed to dismantle Japan's capacity to make war. The post-war Japanese constitution bans Japan from having a military, with the intention of Japan never being able to conduct an aggressive war again. This restriction might sound like a harsh measure from the United States, and even reminiscent of the conditions imposed on Germany by the Treaty of Versailles, but it turns out this was an idea coming from the Japanese authorities themselves. Later on, as the Cold War really established itself, the US even wanted them to establish a military force, but Japan never really rearmed, beyond a small self-defense force, which was actually an extension of the police. It's not until much later that Japan would build a real military, as in during the terms of Japan's two most recent prime ministers. It now has one of the most massive military budgets on Earth. But again, that's a different story. But back to the post-war occupation. Just like Germany, the US made an effort to deindustrialize the country, although to a much lesser extent. And even then, the US began rebuilding the Japanese economy soon afterwards. Okay, so what came next? That would be the process of reforming Japan, taking an authoritarian imperial state devastated by war and putting in tons of liberal reforms. The new Japanese constitution banned most forms of press censorship, save saying anything that might sour people to the American occupation forces, of course. With that, the US then went on to completely restructure Japanese society, government, and economics. Many personal freedoms of religion and conscience became the law of the land. Education through high school became mandatory as well, very similar to the US, and political prisoners were no longer permitted. As we've mentioned a few times, Japan also got a shiny new constitution, which solidified many of these rights. It took inspiration from various documents, varying as far as the US Bill of Rights to the Soviet Constitution. This new Japanese constitution formally made the emperor a ceremonial title and enshrined the military ban, voting rights for women, an empowered parliament, and distributed more power to local governments. With it, they elected their first prime minister in 1946. Many credit the efforts of these reforms to the increased rights for Japanese women. Women came out to vote in the first election in vast numbers, and even elected 39 female politicians in their first election. One woman, by the name of Beata Sirota, was the most prominent advocate for enshrining the equality of women in the Japanese constitution. Lastly, exposure to Western culture also turned some heads and liberalized the role of women in Japanese society. Relatively speaking, anyway. MacArthur rebuilt the economy under FDR's New Deal model, used to combat the Depression in the United States. On top of that, there was massive land reform, which reduced the number of peasants, the people working and living on land they rented from a landlord, by 90%. The right to create and join unions was enshrined, and working conditions were standardized. The plan the US had for the Japanese economy was to make a prosperous, stable country, and importantly, grow a powerful ally. This distribution of land and wealth, of course, had its detractors, especially in the form of well-off Japanese business monopoly leaders and landlords who stood to lose the most, but reforms were made anyway. It would be easy to paint this as a rosy picture of Americans graciously coming to Japan and making the country the great place it is today, but I'd be masking over many darker chapters. Troops stationed in Japan were responsible for thousands of cases of rape during the war and in the early occupation. The Japanese tried to combat this by creating facilities for sex workers, and it worked, but MacArthur shut it down to combat the spread of venereal disease. Reported cases of rape increased eightfold after this, averaging to about 330 sexual assaults on Japanese women per day, which, given how few were probably even reported, might just be the tip of that iceberg. So, what happened to all those troops? Well, the occupation never really ended. Troop numbers declined, especially as the US had other interests in places like Korea and Vietnam. But the occupation of Japan by the US military is still a thing. Military installations there are massive, and friction between US troops and the locals is still a common occurrence. A quick Google search of incidents involving US military personnel in Okinawa is proof of that. The Japan of today is now one of the world's largest economies and a truly unique modern state. From the ashes of the Second World War, the US fostered the growth of a powerful ally in a tough region for them. Japan would often act as an important logistics center for US operations in the Pacific and play a significant role in the Cold War in Asia. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure that you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com or on Facebook at www.facebook.com/thecoldwartv. We rely on our patrons to create these videos, so consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.